Snow fell quietly over Silver Hollow the morning a Marine sniper and his K9 sensed danger no one else could feel. Hundreds of children laughed on their way to a school festival, unaware a hidden ambush waited above the wooden bridge. Only the dog, Shadow, froze, ears lifted, muscles trembling, warning her handler that something invisible was already moving in the trees. And only Mason Riker, a soldier shaped by loss and instinct, understood what that silence truly meant. Before the first shot ever echoed, destiny had already placed two guardians in the right place at the right time. What followed was a battle of shadows. A lone Marine, a loyal dog, and a mysterious sniper known only as the Huntsman. Tonight, you'll hear how faith, instinct, and a miracle stopped a tragedy. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe. The first breath of autumn drifted through Silver Hollow like a soft hymn, brushing its cool fingers across rooftops, porches, and the long stretch of Main Street where hand-painted signs welcomed travelers with maple pies and steaming cider. The northern sky glowed in a pale cornflower blue, and the kind of gentle, forgiving light that made the world look briefly kinder softened the edges of every house. Staff Sergeant Mason Riker, 35, stood beside his dusty Marine pickup at the corner of the town square, tightening the strap of his rucksack. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, sharp cheekbones, and a jaw that always looked a day past clean-shaven. His brown hair was clipped close in a regulation cut, flecked with a thread or two of early gray, and his storm-colored eyes held the quiet alertness of someone who never fully stepped out of combat mode. Years of deployments had etched a certain gravity into his posture, an intensity softened only by the steady presence of the German shepherd sitting at his heel. Shadow, 4 years old and built like a living blade of muscle wrapped in sable black and gray fur, watched the square with ears high and nose twitching. The dog carried himself with the regal tension of a creature who understood danger long before humans sensed it. He had a triangular patch of pale fur on his chest and eyes with a warm amber gold that flashed with intelligence. To the townspeople, he looked like a loyal companion. To Mason, Shadow was a compass, part instinct, part miracle. Silver Hollow wasn't home, not in the traditional sense, but the Marine Corps had sent Mason here on a temporary attachment to assist local law enforcement with training and security for the upcoming Autumn Ridge Festival. That was the story on paper. In truth, Mason carried a quiet assignment: assess unusual disturbances on the northern ridge. Vague reports the higher-ups dismissed as local paranoia. Nothing had exploded yet, so nobody was listening. Nobody except the Marine they had sent to nod politely and keep the peace. The first person Mason met that morning was Sheriff Ellen Crowley, a woman in her late 40s with copper-brown hair pulled into a no-nonsense ponytail. She had the wiry, compact build of someone who spent more time outdoors than in an office, and eyes that scanned the world with a mix of suspicion and reluctant affection. Her uniform fit her like armor she had worn for decades, and she extended her hand with a grip firm enough to tell him she tolerated no nonsense. "Welcome to Silver Hollow, Staff Sergeant." Her voice had the grit of gravel, but the warmth of someone who'd lost people and didn't want to lose more. "You'll find our town quiet, boring even. Hopefully it stays that way." "Quiet is underrated," Mason replied with his dry, nearly invisible humor. "Chaos tends to ruin my weekends." Crowley huffed something between a laugh and a sigh. "You military types always say that before everything goes to hell." Shadow approached her, sniffed her boots, and surprisingly nudged her leg with approval. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Your partner there always this friendly?" Mason smirked. "He's not friendly. He just likes people who carry peppermints. You have some in your left pocket." Crowley blinked down at her pocket, surprised. "How?" "He smelled it," Mason said simply. Shadow gave a proud little huff, as if confirming the trick. A group of children passed on their way to school, bundled in fleece jackets with lunch boxes swinging. One of them, a lanky boy with curly blonde hair, stopped to stare at Shadow with wide eyes. "Sir, can I pet your dog?" Shadow sat perfectly still, tail low, ears perked, not aggressive, just thoughtful. "If he comes to you," Mason said, "you can." The shepherd studied the boy for a full 2 seconds before stepping forward and bumping his head gently against the boy's hand. The kid lit up, giggling as Shadow leaned into the contact. Crowley observed the scene with a softened look. "Guess he picks his favorites." "He does," Mason murmured, watching Shadow's calm posture. "But he never chooses wrong." When the boy ran off, Mason noticed a figure watching from across the street. Mark Garrison, principal of Silver Hollow Elementary. Garrison was a man in his mid-50s, tall but slightly stooped, with salt and pepper hair combed back neatly. His face was thin, marked by kindness, but also by the weight of too many long nights, worrying about budgets, safety drills, and children who carried invisible burdens. He had the gentle energy of someone who believed schools should be sanctuaries, a belief tested too many times in modern America. He crossed the street with a warm smile. "I heard we were getting help from the Marines. Thank you for being here." His handshake was gentle, almost scholarly. The festival next week means bus routes, kids on the road, and, well, more things that can go wrong. Mason nodded. "That's why we're here. Just making sure nothing surprises us." Garrison exhaled slowly. That would be a welcome change. Shadow stared past the principal into the direction of the northern ridge. His ears slowly rose. His body stiffened in an almost imperceptible way. Mason felt the shift like a ripple of electricity. Shadow suddenly emitted a low, rumbling growl, the kind that came not from fear, but from warning. The sound rolled like distant thunder. He wasn't looking at Garrison, nor at the passing cars, nor at the children now disappearing around the school corner. He was staring at a single pickup truck, painted forest green, idling across the street near a row of old birch trees. Inside, behind the tinted window, a man watched them back. Mason couldn't see his face, but he caught a glint. Maybe a scope, maybe a piece of metal. Something that didn't belong in a quiet morning. And just like that, the truck pulled away. No hurry, no guilt, just purpose. Shadow's growl softened, but didn't stop until the truck vanished around the bend. Crowley's brows knit. "Your dog sense something?" "He senses everything," Mason murmured. "And he doesn't make mistakes." The morning suddenly felt colder. Crowley led Mason and Shadow to the sheriff's substation by the river, a squat building with coffee-colored brick and windows reinforced after a break-in many years prior. Inside, a deputy named Sarah Lindholm greeted them, a tall, lean woman in her early 30s with pale skin, freckles across her nose, and auburn hair pulled into a messy bun. She moved with an anxious efficiency, as if every delay carried consequences. Her green eyes had the nervous brightness of someone who tried too hard to prove she belonged. Sarah offered Mason a tight smile. "Sheriff tells me you'll help with the Ridge Patrol later. I'm grateful. I don't love being out there alone since the incidents." "Incidents?" Mason asked. Sarah hesitated. "Animals found dead, a few hunters missing. Most folks think it's bears or early snowstorms. But the tracks," she swallowed. "Tracks look human, heavy, Precise. Mason studied her, reading the exhaustion in her posture. How long you been sheriff's deputy? 3 years, she answered. Moved here after my marriage ended. I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere that felt safe. She looked away. Silver Hollow was supposed to be that place. Mason nodded gently. Safety is a team effort. We'll make it safer. Shadow approached Sarah, sniffed her boots, then circled her once as if assessing her heartbeat, her fear, the fragility she tried to hide. Then he sat next to her and nudged her hand, an unusual gesture of comfort. Sarah blinked rapidly. He likes me? He trusts you, Mason corrected. There's a difference. The sheriff's radio cracked with static before a voice murmured through. Crowley, we've got another report from White Elk Ridge. A hiker swears he heard shots at sunrise. Crowley cursed under her breath. Every year something tries to ruin my festival. Or someone, Mason said quietly. The sheriff opened a topographical map on the table. This is where the hiker claimed to hear it, near the old fire lookout. Nobody goes there anymore. Mason scanned the map. High vantage point, overlooks the school road. Sarah crossed her arms, shivering though the room was warm. You think someone is watching the town? I think someone is watching something, Mason said. He didn't say the rest, and Shadow saw him first. Later that afternoon, Mason walked the northern trail with Shadow trotting ahead, pausing every few yards to sniff the wind. The forest was a cathedral of sound, leaves whispering, branches ticking, the crunch of early frost beneath boots. Shadow's body language shifted again. He froze, one paw, lifted, ears forward. Mason followed his gaze to a cluster of rocks near a fallen pine. There, half buried in moss, lay a spent rifle casing, high-grade, clean, not weathered, recently fired. Another step revealed footprints, deep, deliberate, military in spacing. Someone carrying weight, someone trained. Shadow pressed his nose to the prints, then looked up at Mason with a silent message. This isn't an accident. Someone is here. Someone dangerous. A gust of wind rustled the ridge, carrying the faintest scent of cold iron like gunmetal. Mason exhaled slowly. We're not alone out here, boy. They finished the patrol, but the air had changed. The calm of Silver Hollow felt like the false stillness before a storm. Every instinct in Mason's body, the instincts sharpened by years of being the last line of defense in foreign lands, told him the same thing Shadow already knew. Something was coming. Something calculated. And this quiet town did not see it. As dusk settled, Mason stood by the riverbank, Shadow pressed against his leg. The water rippled with gold and red as the sun sank behind the ridge. Children's laughter drifted from distant streets. For a moment, Mason wished the world could stay that simple. But the memory he carried, the one that never let him sleep before midnight, surfaced. Arriving 5 minutes too late on a mission overseas, finding the civilians he was meant to protect already gone. 5 minutes. That failure shaped him more than any medal. Shadow nudged him gently. I know, Mason whispered, thought heavy. Not this time. In the fading light, a single raven flew across the ridge, its silhouette slicing a lonely arc through the sky. Mason watched it disappear above the treetops, and a quiet vow formed inside him. Unshakable, steady, carved into bone, he would stay alert. He would listen to the instincts humans ignored. And he would follow Shadow, even into the teeth of whatever stalked Silver Hollow. Because fate had already tapped him on the shoulder, and fate rarely knocks twice. The morning after the strange encounter on Main Street, Silver Hollow woke beneath a muted gray sky. A thin mist drifted between the trees, like wandering spirits reluctant to choose a direction. Staff Sergeant Mason Riker walked along the gravel path behind the sheriff's substation, Shadow trotting ahead with his tail level and ears high. Last night had left a weight in Mason's thoughts. Shadow rarely reacted without cause, and the image of the forest green truck slipping away still gnawed at him like a thread he couldn't stop pulling. Inside the substation, Sheriff Crowley sat hunched over a stack of reports. Her copper hair was pulled tighter than usual, her posture rigid, eyes sharper. "We've got another missing hunter," she said, sliding the folder across the desk. "Local man. Name's Clint Marrow, 38. Fiery type. Likes to fight with anyone who disagrees with him." Clint Marrow lived on the edge of the woods, in a run-down cabin, known for a temper that could curdle milk. Tall, lean, with a black beard grown too long and eyes that looked perpetually offended, Clint had a reputation for drinking until he couldn't see straight, then picking fights with people unlucky enough to be near him. When sober, he wasn't cruel, just bitter, cracked around the edges, a man shaped by disappointments that piled up like unpaid bills. "You think he wandered too far?" Mason asked. Crowley shook her head. "Clint's a grouch, but he knows these woods better than anyone." She lowered her voice. "And he told Deputy Sarah something odd last week. Said he saw a man on the ridge tracking him, not a hunter. Someone moving, professionally." Mason raised a brow. "Professionally?" Clint said the guy walked like he had a rifle even when he didn't. That caught Mason's attention. What did Sarah think? "She thought he was drunk," Crowley said. "But Clint swore he was sober. There was fear in him, Mason. Real fear." Shadow placed both paws on the sheriff's knee, staring up at her with quiet intensity, as if reading the tension in her tone. Crowley reached down and absently scratched behind his ear. "I'm starting to trust this dog more than half my deputies," she muttered. Mason gave a faint smile. "You're not the first to say that." The sheriff stood. "You two should check Clint's cabin. If he's holed up or injured, he'll need help. And if he's not there, maybe you'll find something worth reading." They left the substation and hiked into the narrowing forest trail. The trees grew denser the further they walked, branches interlacing overhead like fingers trying to hold back the sky. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. The only sound the crunch of frost-dusted leaves under Mason's boots and the soft rhythm of Shadow's breathing. They reached Clint Marrow's cabin after 30 minutes. It sat hunched in a small clearing, built from weather-worn boards and crowned with a sagging metal roof. A broken porch light dangled from a wire, tapping occasionally against the siding. Shadow stopped short at the edge of the clearing, stiffening, head tilted slightly. His nose twitched once, twice. Then he gave a short, sharp bark, alert, not aggressive. Mason murmured, "What is it, partner?" Shadow trotted forward and sniffed the ground near the porch steps. Mason followed him and saw it, a smear of dried mud mixed with something darker. A boot print, deep, precise, too controlled for a drunken stumble. Next to it, a second set of tracks overlapped the first, heavier, larger, and spaced in a way Mason recognized instantly. "Someone was here," Mason said softly, "and not Marrow." He pushed open the cabin door, which groaned like a wounded animal. Inside, the room smelled of damp wood and old coffee. A single mug sat on the table, half full, cold. Papers were scattered across the floor, maps, hunting routes, one sheet marked with a shaky hand. "He watches from the west ridge. He knows where I walk." Mason crouched, reading the trembling handwriting. Clint had been terrified, not drunk, not hallucinating. Shadow paced the room in slow circles, nose low, tail stiff. He stopped suddenly in front of the bedroom door, growling softly. Mason approached, nudged it open, and found nothing but a messy cot and a toppled lamp. No blood, no signs of a struggle. But Clint Marrow was gone. Shadow moved toward the window, pressing his paws up and staring out into the tree line. Mason stepped beside him and saw what the dog had already found. On a branch outside, caught in a splinter of bark, hung a tiny piece of fabric, forest green canvas, the exact shade of the truck they had seen the day before. Mason's pulse tightened. Someone was watching him and us. They left the cabin and followed the tracks west. The trail wove through shadowed pines, past a narrow ravine and a small frozen stream. The prints ended abruptly near an outcrop of rock, a vantage point overlooking half the valley, including the trail kids took to school each morning. Mason scanned the trees, feeling the eyes of the forest pressing in. Something about the silence felt wrong, not empty, but expectant. Shadow lowered his body, tail straight, muscles coiled. His ears twitched with alert precision, turning before Mason even heard anything. A single faint metallic click echoed through the trees, so soft most humans would dismiss it as nothing. But Shadow's reaction was immediate and explosive. He lunged sideways, slamming his body against Mason's leg, forcing him down behind a fallen log just as a sharp hiss cut the air. A bullet embedded itself in the bark where Mason's head had been. Mason froze, breath caught. Shadow stood over him, teeth bared in total silence. No barking, no panic. Only the cold, calm certainty of a creature who knew death had just brushed past them. For a heartbeat, the forest felt alive with eyes. Then the presence withdrew as quickly as it had come. Whoever fired that shot had no intention of killing Mason, only measuring him, testing. And that was far worse. The air trembled as if the woods themselves held their breath. Mason rose slowly, scanning the tree line with soldier's precision. He saw nothing. No movement, no glint. The shot had come from a high vantage and from someone who understood wind, distance, timing. Someone trained. Shadow nudged Mason's thigh, urging him backward. The dog wasn't afraid. He was resolute, guiding him, insisting they retreat before the unseen watcher struck again. Mason let him lead. On the walk back toward town, Mason replayed the moment again and again. The bullet had been angled deliberately to miss. A warning, not an attempt. Someone wanted him alive, wanted him thinking, wanted him unsettled. They reached a wide gravel turn near the main forest road where a blue pickup waited. A man leaned against it. Deputy Caleb Norris, a new arrival from a neighboring county. Norris was in his early 40s, with a square jaw covered in a sandy brown stubble and broad shoulders that stretched his flannel shirt. His skin had the roughness of someone who worked outdoors year-round. He had friendly eyes, but something in them flickered, like he once carried a secret that shaped him into a man who smiled more out of politeness than contentment. "You two look like you've seen a ghost," Norris said. His voice was warm but cautious. Mason studied him briefly. "Something like that." Norris glanced toward Shadow, who was still stiff and alert. "He picking up something, Bet?" "He always does," Mason replied. Norris chewed the inside of his cheek. "Sheriff sent me to check on you, said the woods felt off." Mason nodded. "She's right." They filled Norris in on Clint's disappearance and the shot fired from the ridge. Norris's brow furrowed deeper with each detail. "This isn't just hunters fooling around. Someone's scouting us." "Or testing us," Mason added. Norris exhaled slowly. "Sheriff won't like this." Shadow barked once, sharp, insistent, then turned toward town, waiting for them to follow. Norris muttered, "Your partner's got instincts better than most tracking dogs I've seen." "He's more than instinct," Mason said. "He sees what we don't." They hiked back toward Silver Hollow as the sky dimmed into a bruised violet. Streetlights flickered alive one by one. Families walked home with grocery bags, unaware of the shadows threading through their quiet world. Mason felt the weight of responsibility settling on his spine like an old, familiar burden. At the substation, Sheriff Crowley listened in stony silence. When Mason mentioned the shot, her jaw tightened. "You're saying someone took aim at you and missed on purpose?" "I'm saying someone wants me to know he's there," Mason answered. Crowley's eyes hardened. "We need to get ahead of this before the festival, before the school buses, the crowds, the roads packed with families." Shadow sat beside Mason, tail wrapped around his paws, gaze steady and solemn, almost human in its understanding. Crowley looked at the dog. "And what does he think?" Mason answered softly, "He thinks we're running out of time." Outside, the wind howled down from the ridge, a cold, hollow sound that spoke of something preparing to strike. And Silver Hollow, wrapped in its small-town innocence, had no idea how close danger had wandered. The morning fog clung to the pines like pale silk as Mason Hale stepped off the gravel road and into the cold breath of the forest. The autumn festival was only 1 week away, and the school's 3 yellow buses would soon carry nearly 100 children across the old Timberfall Bridge, a bridge older than most homes in Cedar Hollow, built from thick-cut beams that had survived half a century of storms. It was tradition, a symbol, a passage from quiet valley life into the glowing mountain resort where the children roasted marshmallows, listened to live music, and marched in the lantern parade. Mason respected traditions, but he trusted instincts more, and his instincts had not rested since dawn. Shadow padded beside him, silent but alert. The 4-year-old German shepherd moved with the fluid tension of a creature tuned to invisible frequencies. Her sable coat shimmered in the broken sunlight, and her ears twitched to sounds buried beneath the forest's breathing. Mason glanced down at her as they followed the stream. She walked perfectly in sync with him, nose sweeping the cold air, tail lowered in concentration. She was born for this work, shaped for it, and somehow understood danger before men even smelled it. Ahead, the bridge rose from the fog with its familiar bowed spine, stretching across the narrow gorge like a relic holding its place against time. The creek below rushed in silver strokes, carrying fallen leaves like paper boats toward deeper waters. Everything seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. Shadow froze. Her body stiffened, weight shifting onto her forelegs. Her nose pressed low to the damp earth near one of the supporting beams. She inhaled sharply, rumbled a low growl, then began pawing hard at one particular plank. A board that looked newer than the rest, its color too fresh, its edges too smooth. Mason crouched, brushing away a layer of moss. Something metallic glinted beneath. He lifted his radio. "Carver Team Alpha, this is Hale. I need maintenance verification on the Timberfall Bridge. One board replaced recently?" Static crackled before a tired male voice responded. "Probably the maintenance crew. They've been patching things all month. Don't overthink it, Staff Sergeant. This isn't a war zone." Mason didn't answer. Shadow's growl deepened, and she began tracing a line along the base of the bridge. When Mason followed her movement, he saw it. An almost invisible filament stretched across the rocks and vanishing into the underbrush, camouflaged with moss and fallen leaves. A cable, thin as fishing wire but strong enough to snap tensioned wood if pulled correctly. Mason set his jaw, sweeping his flashlight along the outer beams. "Control, This is Hale. You need to put a temporary stop on bus travel tomorrow. I'm seeing drilled holes, spaced, intentional. Someone's rigging structural points. A sigh crackled back. We can't disrupt the festival. Media's already lined up to film the parade. Sheriff Crowley signed off on the safety check yesterday. That check wasn't done here, Mason replied evenly. I walked the south end. The north end was never inspected. Staff Sergeant. The voice hardened. Stand down. You're reading Ghosts in the Wood. This is Montana, not Helmand Province. The radio clicked off. Mason stared at the bridge in silence. He had heard those words before. Right before something detonated. Right before a patrol didn't return. Right before one man's doubt turned into another man's funeral. Shadow pressed her head against his knee, sensing the storm behind his eyes. He walked the perimeter twice more. The cable ran upward, disappearing into a rock wall thick with brush. The drilled holes were unmistakable. Small, deliberate, angled for weight distribution. Someone had engineered this, and someone expected children to cross. Later that evening, Cedar Hollow's small mountain lodge glowed dimly against the falling dusk. Mason sat on the steps outside his room, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped loosely. Shadow lay across his boots, her chest rising and falling with controlled rest. But her ears never stilled. They flicked every time a car passed on the road. The festival village lights blinked from afar. Soft oranges and warm golds. Families laughed in the distance, preparing decorations, unaware that anything beneath their peaceful lives could fracture. Mason didn't belong to peaceful things. The Marine Corps had carved that out of him years ago. But he understood the privilege of others having what he didn't. He intended to protect that. A low engine hum crept around the bend. A truck approached, an old blue pickup with a tarp thrown over its bed. It slowed near the lodge, almost to a stop. Even from 50 yards, Mason recognized the way a vehicle hesitates when its driver wants to remain unseen. Shadow shot upright. Her growl was immediate and deep, an instinctive warning she rarely used. Her fur bristled along her spine, and her eyes narrowed sharply toward the truck as it lingered beside the slope. Then, the driver pressed the accelerator. The truck rolled forward and disappeared into the trees. Shadow barked once, sharp and haunting. Shadow suddenly lunged toward the hill, pulling Mason a half step forward. Her body rigid, nose slicing the cold air. She stared at the exact patch of darkness where the truck had paused. A low whine left her throat, not fear, but recognition. As if she had scented someone she had feared once, or someone she had known. Mason felt the hair on his arms rise. Dogs didn't imagine ghosts. Something, or someone, behind that truck had meaning, and not the kind that left bridges rigged for children. A beam of intuition struck him so sharply he had to steady himself. If Shadow sensed a predator, then a predator had come home. Night swallowed the last of the festival lights as Mason returned inside. But sleep never came. He spread maps across the small desk, marking locations. The bridge, the slope where the truck waited, the creek path, the likely route to the cliffs. He tracked the cable's angle, tracing where a device could be anchored, how much force could break the wooden support. Shadow paced the room, restless. Easy, girl, Mason murmured, though her tension fed his own. He replayed every detail. The replaced plank, the drilled holes, the official dismissal, the unmarked truck. It formed a pattern too sharp to ignore. At midnight, he stepped outside again. The temperature had dropped, coating the roofs with frost. But somewhere in the forest, a twig snapped softly, too deliberate, too precise. Shadow stiffened. Mason scanned the dark, hand resting against the grip of his service pistol. The woods answered with silence. He knew what that meant. Someone was watching the bridge even now. Someone was checking the trap. Someone was expecting the buses. As dawn approached, Mason made his decision. He would be at the bridge before first light. He would follow that cable to its source. He would find whoever planned to use a valley full of children as leverage, vengeance, or spectacle. Shadow pressed against his side, steady and ready. "Tomorrow," Mason whispered to her, "we hunt first." The wind rustled the trees in soft warning, leaves drifting across the dirt road like scattered omens. Far above, the old wooden bridge stood in the pale moonlight, ancient and innocent. But Mason knew better. Bridges existed to carry lives safely across. This one had been turned into a weapon. The day of the festival dawned bright enough to fool the untrained eye. Sunlight poured across Silver Hollow's valley like a blessing, warming the frost off rooftops and turning the forest canopy into a mosaic of gold and fire red. Parents waved from driveways while children in puffy jackets, blue, neon green, cherry red, marched toward the school buses with the kind of excitement only autumn adventures could spark. The air smelled of cinnamon pastries, pine sap, and clean mountain cold. The town looked like a postcard, polished and safe. Only Shadow refused to be fooled. As families gathered, the German shepherd stuck close to Mason's leg, her fur bristling every time the breeze carried the faint metallic tang from the mountains. She glanced back toward the ridgeline again and again, ears tilting, nose twitching as though listening for a voice Mason couldn't hear. Her energy was taut, a violin string pulled too tight. Mason pretended to move casually among the crowd, but inside his stomach twisted. He had already decided his orders meant nothing today. Not after what he saw at the bridge, not after Shadow's reaction to the blue truck, and not after the silence from the base when he reported tampering. He attached his comms unit, checked the battery, and clipped his binoculars to his belt. Shadow watched him with the solemn intensity of a soldier receiving instructions. "You ready?" he whispered. Shadow nudged his hand once, firm and confident. The buses revved their engines. Teachers took attendance. Mason and Shadow slipped away unnoticed. They hiked up the narrow service trail leading to the abandoned cable car tower, an old steel structure built long before Mason was born. It had once carried tourists up the ridge before the state closed it for safety concerns. Now only hunters and maintenance crews used the trail. But the tower offered a perfect vantage point. The bridge to the left, the school bus's route straight ahead, and the forest line hugging the valley like a curved blade. Shadow leapt over fallen logs with the ease of a creature who had memorized the forest's language. Mason climbed the final slope and reached the tower ladder, glancing behind him once more to ensure they hadn't been followed. From up here, every sound echoed differently. Every shift of the branches mattered. They climbed. At the top where Mason set up his position. The platform groaned under his weight, rusted metal, flaking paint, a relic of a forgotten era. But its height gave him the one thing he needed: truth. And the truth became clear the moment he lifted the binoculars. Movement in the brush, orange vests, but too clean, too perfectly placed. Hunters didn't hold positions like that. They didn't sit in silence, coordinated across a half-mile stretch of forest. Then there was the glint, a brief, precise flicker of light from the jagged ridge opposite the bridge, the sun's reflection off a scope. Mason's breath stilled. That wasn't an amateur. That was a sniper deliberately adjusting his glass. Shadow paced beside him, nose pointed toward the ridge. She couldn't see what Mason saw, but she sensed the malice. She let out a low, warning rumble that vibrated against the metal floor. You feel it too, Mason murmured. He lifted his radio. Overwatch to command. I'm seeing unauthorized armed presence near the bridge. This is not a drill. You need to halt the buses immediately. Static. He switched frequencies. County, state, military liaison. Nothing. Static swallowed every channel. He changed to an emergency marine bandwidth, expecting at least partial interference. Instead, a faint male voice filtered through, distorted but unmistakably cold, clipped and American. A bus entering kill zone. 2 minutes. Wait for signal from Huntsman. Mason's blood iced. Huntsman. Not a nickname kids made up. Not a local troublemaker. That was a call sign. A professional one. Shadow pressed her body against Mason's thigh, trembling not from fear, but from fury. Her hackles stood tall, her eyes fixed on the forest line like she could see the ghosts hiding there. Down the road, the first yellow bus appeared. Children laughing, teachers singing. Windows filled with tiny hands waving autumn crafts. Below them, unseen weapons waited. Mason lifted the binoculars again, scanning the tree line, marking 3 possible ambush nests. His military mind assembled patterns automatically. The arcs of fire, the choke point at the bridge, the timing. This wasn't chaos. This was choreography. A domestic ambush designed with military precision. Beside him, Shadow let out a soft whine, stepping forward to the railing as though urging him to move, to act, to abandon hesitation the way soldiers abandoned warmth in the field. Then the radio clicked again. Hold until Huntsman marks target. Bridge must fail on second bus. Repeat. Second bus. The second bus carried the youngest children. Mason's grip tightened around the binoculars. Not today, he whispered. Shadow suddenly snapped her head to the left, toward the ridgeline opposite the bridge. Her entire posture changed, tense, rigid, every muscle locked. Her lips curled back silently, not in fear, but in recognition. For the first time, Mason heard her growl a name she could not speak. A memory, a scent, something buried deep. She backed up, then barked once, sharp and desperate, and pointed her nose directly at one figure in the brush. A figure Mason had not yet seen. He focused his binoculars. A man crouched behind a pine trunk, camouflaged too well for a local hunter, posture too disciplined, movements too calculated. Mid-40s, square jaw, graying buzz cut, wearing a non-standard tactical vest. The kind used by private contractors, those who operated in shadows, outside uniform and law. And on his right forearm, barely visible beneath the cloth, a faded tattoo. A wolf's skull, surrounded by coordinates. Shadow whined, a sound of recognition, betrayal, and dread. As if she knew this man, as if this man had once been part of her past. Mason's heart lurched. Dogs did not fake memory. Dogs did not imagine fear. Dogs remembered their monsters. Below, the buses were approaching the bridge. Time was up. Mason grabbed the M40A5 rifle, checked the bolt, chambered around. The weapon felt heavier today, not physically, but in consequence. He crouched behind the railing, Shadow sliding beside him with perfect soldierly discipline, her body low, ears pinned, ready for whatever came next. "All right, girl," Mason said softly, steadying his breathing. "Looks like we're doing something stupid again." Shadow licked his glove once, as if to say she'd follow him into fire. Mason sighted the first target, the sniper overlooking the kill zone. He exhaled slowly, muscle memory taking over from a decade of deployments. The crosshairs steadied, one breath, one heartbeat, one choice. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked through the valley, echoing off the cliff walls like a warning carved into stone. Birds erupted from the treetops. The hidden men pivoted in shock. The buses screeched to a halt at the bridge entrance. Shadow lunged to the railing, barking furiously, her voice ripping through the forest with a primal command. Run! Hide! Danger! Mason chambered another round. The hunters had become the hunted. The first rifle shot still echoed across the valley when Mason shifted position on the cable tower, boots scraping against rusted metal, breath sharp in the cold air. The autumn forest exploded beneath him in a storm of red and gold leaves stirred by gunfire and the sudden shrieks of children. The yellow school buses had skidded to a stop near the entrance of the old wooden bridge, tires screeching against gravel as teachers crouched low, waving their arms, trying to keep the kids' heads down. It was a scene that did not belong to Montana. Yet it unfolded with the cruel precision of a battlefield Mason knew too well. Shadow pressed close to his side, her body taut, eyes burning with a mix of fear and fury. She understood this chaos, remembered it in her bones, and hated it with a ferocity that rippled through every hair along her spine. Below the tower, 3 figures scrambled near the base of the bridge, men in mismatched gear, but moving with practiced efficiency. One knelt, lifting a block-shaped object. Mason recognized it instantly. A shaped charge, crude but effective. The second man flicked open a lighter, preparing the trigger line. They meant to bring the bridge down. His rifle was already raised. The M40A5 felt alive in his hands, familiar in a terrible way. He exhaled. Crack. A single bullet ripped through the morning air. The man holding the charge dropped first. The second stumbled back, screaming for someone to fire, but Mason shot again. Clean, necessary, clinical. The third man panicked, slamming the detonator prematurely. The blast erupted beneath the bridge's left support, sending tremors through the structure. Boards snapped. Dust clouds rose. The entire bridge shuddered like an animal trying to flee its own death. But it held. Barely. The premature explosion saved lives. But it also signaled the ambushers to execute Plan B. Movement erupted along the tree line. 2 men redirected their weapons, not toward the bridge, but toward the buses. One lifted a scoped rifle. The other carried an RPG launcher, mismatched, foreign-made. No, Mason growled under his breath. He pivoted, recentering his crosshairs. A single breath steadied him. Crack! He dropped the rifleman instantly. Crack! He shattered the RPG carrier's grip, forcing him to fumble backward as the launcher tumbled into the leaves. Shadow barked sharply, warning him of movement at his flank. She wasn't looking at the tree line. She was staring up, toward the opposite ridge, ears pinned so tightly she looked carved from stone. Mason brought the binoculars up and saw him. The Huntsman. Perched on the rocky slope like a creature born for kill zones, the man wore a weather-worn brown hunting coat over tactical gear, his face smeared in mud and charcoal patterns that broke his silhouette. A strip of antler, a real section of whitetail, was attached to his hat like a grisly signature. He carried no insignia, no patch, no organization stamp. Only the air of someone who had lived long enough in war's shadows to stop caring which side he fought for. The Huntsman wasn't aiming at the buses. He was aiming at Mason. Their eyes locked for one impossible heartbeat across the valley. The Huntsman's expression didn't shift. Not a smile, not a frown. Just a hunter's cool acknowledgement of prey. Then his rifle fired. Mason ducked, feeling the shockwave of the bullet as it cracked through a metal support behind his head. He rolled, repositioning, but more bullets tore through the beams around him, forcing him to keep moving. It became a duel of ghosts. 2 shooters, 2 minds, 2 sets of instincts sharpened by deployments neither of them ever fully left. The Huntsman wasn't firing to kill. He was shaving inches off Mason's cover, testing how he moved, how he breathed, how he hesitated. It was profiling, measuring, scoring. Shadow snarled, pacing in a tight circle behind Mason, her nails clicking against steel as she tried to track every thread at once. She suddenly lunged at Mason's pant leg, tugging hard. He pivoted instinctively just as another round screamed past the exact space where his neck had been half a second earlier. "You saved my damn life," he whispered. Then her head jerked downward, ears slicing the air toward the ground far below. Mason followed her gaze and saw a man crawling toward the tower's base. Close enough he could smell the gun oil on his shotgun. The man's face was young, freckles across a sharp jaw, but his eyes were empty, unreadable. The eyes of someone who had erased whatever lines once separated him from violence. Shadow erupted into a howl that shook Mason's chest. Mason fired downward, one precise burst. The shotgun dropped from the man's hands before he slumped sideways into the brush. But even as Mason eliminated the immediate threats, the worst moment in a gunfight arrived. The moment where two bad choices demanded a single answer. From the corner of his scope, he saw the RPG carrier recover his launcher. And the launcher was pointed directly at Bus 2. The bus with the youngest kids. The one carrying little Amy Miller, the 8-year-old girl with braids and missing front teeth who always snuck snacks to Shadow during school safety drills. Shadow sensed it too. She let out a keening, desperate whine Mason had never heard before. A plea, a warning, a cry for help. Mason swiveled, aiming at the RPG carrier. But the Huntsman fired again, the bullet slashing past Mason's cheek, hot enough to burn his skin. Huntsman had shifted his target, not Mason's head, the structural bolts of the tower. One more hit and the platform could collapse. Mason had two targets: save children or stop the sniper. He didn't get both. Damn it, he hissed, choosing before the thought finished forming. He ignored the Huntsman. Instead, he locked onto the RPG carrier just as he squeezed the trigger. Mason fired half a second earlier. His round struck true, throwing the man off balance and sending the rocket spiraling off course. It slammed into the dirt beside the road, detonating in a violent burst of soil and flame that rocked the valley but spared the bus. The driver jerked the wheel and veered onto the grassy clearing, sliding sideways. Kids screamed. Teachers called out. But the bus did not explode. The cost came instantly. A section of the tower's support rod shattered under the Huntsman's next shot. Shrapnel blasted outward. A chunk of rock struck Mason's shoulder, spinning him backward across the platform. Pain exploded through his arm. His vision blurred. He crumpled to the grated floor. Shadow threw herself across his torso, shielding him as more bullets peppered the tower. She wasn't barking now. She was silent, deadly, determined, her body forming a barrier of muscle and loyalty that no training manual could ever replicate. The Huntsman paused his fire. Not out of mercy, but calculation. He wanted Mason alive enough to stand, alive enough to fear, alive enough to understand he was being hunted. Mason Riker had always believed that silence could either heal a man or crush him. In the aftermath of the gunfight, as the emergency crews swept the bridge and parents clutched their children with trembling arms, silence took on a strange third form, something that felt like a verdict waiting to be spoken. The wooden bridge leaned awkwardly on its damaged supports, groaning under its own weight like an old warrior who had survived a battle but would never quite stand the same way again. Teachers cried quietly on the roadside. A few deputies paced in shock, trying to process the fact that a domestic ambush on American soil on a school day had very nearly succeeded. The air smelled of gunpowder, splintered pine, and fear. But there were no child-sized body bags, no rows of little shoes, only injuries, A few broken arms, a bus driver with glass cuts on his face, a teacher with a twisted ankle, and a handful of deputies bruised and shaken. The miracle hung in the air like smoke, refusing to blow away. Shadow limped beside Mason as he walked down from the cable tower. Her left foreleg was wrapped in a temporary bandage, stained faintly from the slice of wood that had cut her. She still held her head high, tail flicking stubbornly as if she refused to let the world see her pain. The moment she reached Mason's knee, she pushed her head beneath his hand, insisting on contact, grounding him. He murmured, "You're the bravest thing on four legs." And Shadow let out a soft huff, something between a sigh and a complaint. But her eyes glowed with loyalty so fierce it almost hurt to look at her. They were treated at a nearby field station before being escorted back to the base. And there, as Mason expected, another battlefield awaited, one made of uniforms, procedure, and judgment. The military hearing was held in a stark gray room inside the administrative wing of Fort Winthrop. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A seal of the United States Marine Corps hung on the wall, its gold and red polished so brightly it felt accusatory. Mason sat at the long table. Shadow curled at his feet despite the medic's warning that she needed rest. Every time someone opened the door, Shadow's ears pricked sharply, her protective instincts humming like a live wire. Colonel Hayes entered last. He looked older than his file suggested, mid-50s, but his hair was nearly white, cropped tight to his skull, and his face was carved with the kind of lines a decade of grief leaves behind. He carried himself like a man shaped by tragedy and responsibility equally. His shoulders were square, his posture immaculate, but his eyes, cold gray, storm-heavy, held a weariness deeper than age. 10 years ago, his son had died in a school shooting. The newspapers never let the country forget. Neither had he. When Hayes sat, the room shifted. His presence was not loud, but it was immovable. "Staff Sergeant Riker," he began, voice flat but controlled, "you've been brought before this board on charges of violating direct orders, abandoning assigned post, discharging a weapon in a civilian zone without authorization, and ignoring command frequencies." Mason answered calmly, "Yes, sir." Hayes regarded him for a long moment. "Before we hear testimony, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Mason glanced down at Shadow. She looked up at him, her golden brown eyes steady, as if reminding him that truth mattered even when it hurt. He inhaled and spoke. "Sir, I saw signs of an impending attack. My reports were dismissed. Children were in danger. I acted to prevent loss of life." No excuses, just truth. The testimonies began. Sheriff Crowley was first. The sheriff carried herself with her usual iron-backed posture, though today her eyes were softer, lined with the weight of what almost happened. "If Staff Sergeant Riker hadn't acted," she said plainly, "Silver Hollow would be burying children this morning. My deputies weren't prepared for a coordinated ambush. None of us were. But he saw it. And that dog of his..." She looked at Shadow with awe. It's like she felt the danger before any of us could name it. Parents spoke next. Teachers. The school principal, Mr. Holloway, a tall man with thinning blonde hair and a voice that quivered no matter how hard he tried to steady it. Every witness used the same word. Miracle. A miracle that Mason had gone to the tower. A miracle Shadow had sensed the ambush. A miracle the second bus hadn't exploded. A miracle guns had fired, but children survived. When Hayes dismissed the last witness, he leaned back, tapping a pen against his notebook thoughtfully. The room fell silent. At length he said, "Staff Sergeant Riker, regulations exist for a reason." "Yes, sir. But so does life. Hayes's voice softened, not in weakness, but in a kind of raw humanity people rarely heard from high-ranking officers. My son died because the adults responsible chose the rules over instinct. I won't repeat their mistake. The word struck the room like a bell. Hayes continued, Your actions violated policy. They also saved nearly 100 children. If I punished you strictly, I'd be telling every Marine under me that choosing life is a crime. He closed his folder. You will receive a formal reprimand, but you will not face court-martial. Shadow's ears lifted at the shift in Mason's breathing. Relief, quiet, restrained. Hayes wasn't finished. In fact, he added, I'm offering you a transfer, a specialized post in North Summit Training Grounds. They're building a program for sharpshooters and K-9 units focused on preemptive threat recognition, trusting animal instinct as much as radio chatter. You and your partner are exactly the kind of team they need. Shadow wagged her tail once, as if accepting on Mason's behalf. Mason nodded. Thank you, sir. Weeks later, the training center became home. North Summit was colder, windier, a stretch of pine forest carved by snow and the distant roar of mountain air. But it felt clean, honest, the kind of place where new beginnings didn't feel like betrayals of the past. Shadow healed quickly, though she still favored her left leg on steep terrain. Medics recommended rest. Shadow disagreed and insisted on following Mason everywhere, limping with infuriating determination until Mason scooped her into his arms, much to her offended huffing. Their cabin was small but warm. A wood stove crackled every night, and Shadow occupied the foot of his bed like a guardian made of fur and stubbornness. One morning, as frost glazed the windows, Mason found a small box outside his door. No return address, no signature, just plain cardboard with a single fingerprint smudged in dust. He brought it inside slowly. Shadow's ears went razor sharp. Mason opened the box. Inside lay a single high-grade hunting cartridge, polished to a gleam. It was the kind used by elite marksmen, expensive, rare, unforgiving. Coiled beneath it was a piece of torn paper, folded twice. Mason unfolded it. The handwriting was sharp, controlled, elegant in the way dangerous men sometimes are. You shoot well. Next time I'll hunt you where there's no one to save but yourself. H. Shadow inhaled the scent of the cartridge, then growled, a low, trembling sound filled with memory and dread. She nudged the box away with her snout, as if rejecting the challenge, or acknowledging it. Mason stared at the note, feeling the weight settle into his bones. The Huntsman wasn't finished. He was waiting. Winter arrived in the northern training grounds with the quiet certainty of a slow-moving tide, settling itself deep into the earth until the landscape was no longer a place but a color, white upon white, stretching into a silence so clean that even memories seemed to whisper softer. The world looked reborn. But to Mason Riker, this season carried the weight of echoes. Snow always did. It reminded him of footprints that disappear too fast, of voices swallowed by wind, of survival measured in breaths and instincts. And it reminded him, inevitably, of that day in Silver Hollow, of a bridge half shattered and a monster in the tree line wearing an antler on his hat. Today, though, he wasn't the hunted Marine on a cable tower. He was an instructor, a teacher, a guardian of the next generation of sharpshooters and their four-legged partners. The training grounds spanned several hundred acres of pine forest and frozen lakes. Wooden towers jutted above the snow like watchful sentinels. The air smelled of powdery frost and gun oil. Young Marines trudged through knee-high drifts, their faces pink from cold, their rifles heavy in untested hands. Shadow ran ahead of Mason, leaping cleanly through the snow with a grace that betrayed her strength. She was fully healed now, her gait smooth and effortless, though the faint scar on her left leg, thin as a carved whisper, remained her permanent badge from Silver Hollow. She wore a new harness marked with the crest of the K9 unit, the leather darkened by snowflakes that melted instantly against her warm fur. Mason watched her for a moment with a half-smile. "Show off," he murmured. Shadow spun back, tail flicking sharply, as if she had heard him and agreed. On the firing line, a group of recruits struggled to steady their rifles against a biting crosswind. One young corporal, Evan Briggs, barely 20, narrow shoulders, freckles dusted across a boyish face, lowered his rifle in frustration. He was built like a farm kid, lean, wiry, but with eyes too gentle for a life behind a scope. "Sir, the wind keeps shifting. It's impossible to read," he protested. Mason raised an eyebrow and pointed at Shadow, who had stopped mid-stride, ears perked, nostrils lifting ever so slightly. If the wind shifted, she felt it before you even noticed your own breath change. Learn to see what she sees. Hear what she hears. The world gives you warnings. You just choose not to listen. Some recruits chuckled nervously, embarrassed but impressed. Briggs swallowed hard and returned to his stance. Shadow trotted beside each Marine, inspecting them with a seriousness Mason had never taught her. She nudged a foot here, corrected a posture there, lifted her head when she sensed doubt. To the recruits, she was both mascot and myth. A creature who knew things men only guessed. And Mason encouraged that belief. Respect born of awe was stronger than respect born of fear. Later in the day, Mason headed into his small office near the edge of the compound. A simple room with pine walls, a humming radiator, and shelves filled with training logs and field manuals. On the desk lay 2 frames side by side. The first held a photograph of Silver Hollow's wooden bridge, newly reinforced, its railings fresh painted, and a line of children walking across it with carefree smiles. The second frame held an old picture of Mason's unit in Afghanistan. Half the men still alive, half ghosts who walked with him in memory. Between the photos sat the polished hunting cartridge Huntsman had mailed to him. Its brass casing caught the winter sunlight like a shard of frozen fire. Mason picked it up, rolling it between his fingers. Shadow entered behind him, paws patting softly, her head tilting as she recognized the object she despised. Her growl was low, instinctive, rooted deep in memory. "I know," Mason whispered. "He's out there somewhere." Shadow laid her chin on his thigh, anchoring him. A knock sounded at the door. Mason looked up as a young administrative officer stepped inside. A petite woman with dark auburn hair pulled tight under her cover, her face sharp, practical, and disciplined. Her nameplate read Gintlet and Mara Elwood. She was new to the unit. 26, compact frame, eyes the shade of storm clouds. She carried an air of competence sharpened by personal struggles. She had grown up in a military family scarred by 3 generations of service, and she wore the weight of expectation like armor. "Staff Sergeant Riker," she said, extending a sealed folder. "Classified dispatch from Central Command, Priority Alpha." Mason accepted the folder. "Anything I should know before I open it?" Elwood hesitated. "Only this. Whatever's inside, the brass said it lines up with the Silver Hollow incident." She glanced toward the cartridge on the desk, then to Shadow, who stared back at her with unsettling intelligence. "Sir, I hope you're ready." Mason gave a quiet, humorless smile. "I've stopped assuming I'm ever ready." Elwood nodded, saluted, and left. Shadow snorted softly after her, unimpressed with people who knocked before entering. Mason opened the folder. Inside were satellite photos of rugged forest land near the northern border, dense, sprawling, speckled with hidden clearings. And next to them were profiles of unidentified combatants, men moving in formation, practicing long-distance marksmanship, stalking drills, synchronized movement. Hunters, soldiers, predators. A note from command read, "Emerging cell. Paramilitary sniper training group operating in northern wilderness. Techniques parallel those observed in Silver Hollow incident. Possible leadership. Individual known as Huntsman. Seek recommendation for counter unit." Mason exhaled slowly, feeling something old and cold rise in him. Not fear, not anger, but purpose. A purpose that was both gift and curse. Shadow leaned in, pressing her head against his side. The moment he touched the folder, she'd stiffened, as if she smelled the same dangerous thread woven into every line of ink. "Looks like he's building something," Mason murmured, "and command wants us to tear it down." Shadow padded to the door, waiting, looking back at him expectantly. Shadow froze mid-step, every hair on her back rising. Her ears snapped forward, pointing directly at the northern tree line beyond the compound. Then she growled, low, trembling, not in fear, but knowing. Mason felt the temperature in the room drop. He moved to the window. Snow drifted lazily across the horizon, but beyond it, in the far distance where the pines grew thick, a faint glint sparked between branches, not sunlight, glass, a lens, a scope. Only for a second, then gone. Shadow didn't move. She stared at that ridge as if she could see the man behind the gun, as if she knew him, as if she had waited for this moment. Mason whispered, "He found us." Shadow's tail lifted, not wagging but pointing like an arrow. "Ready." The cold outside bit harder as Mason led Shadow along the fenced perimeter at dusk. The sky burned pale violet, clouds hanging heavy like unspoken sentences. Their boots crunched through the fresh snow, leaving crisp prints behind. Frost clung to the chain-link fence, turning it into a shimmering veil between safety and the wilderness beyond. They reached the far corner where the pines pressed close. Mason stopped. Shadow sat beside him, breath steaming in small, disciplined puffs. She looked smaller in winter, her sable coat blending with the darkness, her form compact but powerful, her eyes glowing amber in the half-light. For a long moment, neither moved. Mason finally broke the silence. "We'll go to the border woods soon. We'll go before he hunts anyone else, before he turns this place into another Silver Hollow." Shadow lifted her head. "And this time," Mason added quietly, "we won't be late. But listen carefully, girl. Whatever happens." He paused, swallowing emotion he rarely let surface. "We come back together. My dad hated men who made promises they didn't keep." Shadow leaned forward and touched her nose to his hand, firm, deliberate, like a pact formed in old myths where animals spoke without words. A sharp wind rushed over the ridge then, cold, wild, carrying a whisper of metal and pine sap. It felt like a breath from another hunter hidden in the trees. Mason's gaze hardened. Somewhere in the northern mountains, the huntsman was cleaning his rifle, waiting. But this time, Mason and Shadow were not prey. They were returning the hunt. In the end, stories like this remind us that miracles don't always arrive with thunder or light. Sometimes they come through a loyal dog who senses danger before it has a name, or through a weary soldier who chooses courage over comfort. And sometimes they come through the unseen hand of God, guiding two fragile lives through the darkest valley and back into the light. May this tale be a reminder that in our own ordinary days, in the quiet drives to work, in the moments we protect the people we love, in the choices we make when no one is watching, there is a divine presence walking beside us. A presence that whispers strength when we feel empty and hope when the world feels cold. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a reminder that miracles still walk among us. Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and join us in praying that God watches over everyone who hears these words tonight. May His protection surround you and those you love, now and always.